Good afternoon and welcome. I am Tom Ryan, and I am privileged to be sitting alongside Robert Blaze Sacavage, retired President Judge of Northumberland County. And certainly we are here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of you winning Mount Carmel area's second state wrestling championship. And '69 was an interesting year. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Joe Namath beat Baltimore. The Mets won the World Series. And it was the summer of love at Woodstock. But I want to go back a little, Bob, and not talk about '69 so much, but I want to talk about that 1968 football team that you were on, and first undefeated regular season in Mount Carmel area football history. And whether you know this or not, you were a first. Bob Sacavage, Gage Garcia, Jerry Marks, the only area athletes that were first team All-State in football and a state wrestling champion. Doesn't happen all that often.
I guess not. I knew about Gage. I forgot about Jerry. He was a great athlete.
He was a two-timer in football. But the combination of wrestling and football, you would think it may have happened more often. But nonetheless, you were the first in the area to do that. All right, 1968, guys are unbeaten. Only the 30 and 39 teams pitched more shutouts than you guys. You had 8.
Out of 11 games, that's correct.
Now, talk about some of the guys on that defense.
It was just a great defensive effort. We had some sturdy seniors. I was a linebacker. Dennis Lentini was my other linebacker. We enjoyed that senior year. We had our own little mutual admiration society, a little competition, and worked well. Mike Dubb was a tremendous defensive tackle. Jack Shermer played defensive end. We had John Reginis. And our backs, Gary Diminick, Bobby Veach. We also had Tom Chesney in there a few times. It was overall, and the 2 defensive guards were sophomores, Dookie Narcavage and Joe Michalko, and they were in a heavy competition all the way through. But it worked well. We had good coaching. We had a lot of kids that played aggressive football, and a sense of pride in those days that you just don't see.
Well, it's interesting because when people talk about that team, they talk about the running backs, Diminick, Veach, Carmi DeFrancesco, and big number 66 opened them some holes up front. You had some good men up front with you on the offensive side.
Yeah, I was the pulling guard. The major offensive weapon was the Green Bay sweep, or as we call it, student body left and student body right.
Sure.
And that was in the making for a few years. Jazz was a historical guy, great coach. When I started my football career, I was a running back. I was a fullback in the early years, and he converted me in sophomore year to guard. I was none too happy about going from fullback to guard, but I stayed with it, and Jazz was right. He had these tremendous running backs. He didn't need another guy back. He needed somebody to lead the way. So the wrestling gave me a lot of quickness. I had a little speed from the running days, and I was a pulling guard, and that's what helped me become first team.
I recently had a nice conversation with Jose Gonzalo, who you know, of course, and everyone throughout the area does. And when I asked him, I said, what were like 3 of the greatest football games that he could remember? And we agreed on 2 of them, and you played in 2 of the 3. And the first one would have been 32-28 over Carlisle.
Never forget that game. That was for the pride of the coal region. We had a very good team, Greg Doviak and Dabby Niglio and Bobby Hammernick, and Walter Lutz was on that team. That was a very, very good team. And Carlisle, the Thundering Herd,
yes,
had not been beaten for 2 seasons. They were regarded as maybe the best team in the state of Pennsylvania. The year before, they came up to the Coal region and played St. Clair, which is part of the Pottsville School District. It's like a suburb of Pottsville. And they clobbered St. Clair. And when they went back and did their post-game interviews, their coach, I think it was Coach Whitehead, didn't have any very bright words for the Coal region football. He thought it wasn't a real great brand of football. And so those thoughts lingered. There was a article in the Harrisburg Patriot News about Mount Carmel, and not Mount Carmel, but Coal region football. Well, we got the game the next year with it was a 2-game series. They came up here with this tremendous, they had a couple All-State players on a team, one of their running backs, one of their linemen. And I didn't start yet. It was about the 4th game of the year. Dennis Lentini was playing. And on the opening kickoff, Dennis Lentini was wiped out. He got a severe knee injury. He was out of the game. The coach, Cal Ritter, said, "Get in there." And so I had to jump in, a debut with this football game. And that was like heart attack city. We had the ambulances running, through the stadium carrying people out. I recall driving down from the high school down 3rd Street. And there's always some crowd, and a band would come down. But it was different that night. They were 3 and 4 deep down the street. The stadium was filled. On the hillsides, all the hillsides, the coal banks were filled. And it was a lot of pressure, and it was a great team effort. And that was the night that Dabby Niglio became a superstar. Yep. Greg Doviak connected with him for some incredible passes. And the game started, the opening kickoff, by the way, where Dennis was taken out, was a touchdown. They ran the opening touchdown back. And we thought we were going to be in for a long night. And we played hard and tough. And I remember being on a field counting down the last seconds, and they were on a drive. And a clock expired, and we were on the winning side, and that was a glorious day.
It's certainly a game that, although it took place so many years ago, that people talk about all the time when you talk about Mount Carmel football. Now, the second game that I want to talk a little bit about here, it came on the short end. But I don't think Chuck Smeltz has ever had to buy a cup of coffee in Sunbury ever since. What a marvelous football game that was.
I will tell you, I bought a car from Chuck Smeltz about 20 years later, but that was a good game. I was a junior, and we had lost a lot of seniors the year before, Niglio and Dabby and all that crew, and but we had some pretty good athletes, a few starters from the year before. We came down, we were both undefeated. The year before, the only game we lost that stopped us from the championship was Shikellamy, and they had beaten us the year before that, so the game seemed like it was a one-sided game. We had a better team, no question in my mind. It was a lot of fans because it was a grudge game. We felt we lost it by a nose the year before. So in this game, we were running up and down a field. We had a tremendous running fullback, Joe Ambrose.
Oh yeah. Sure.
Joe, he was a big guy. He was strong. We used to regard him as a latter-day Jim Thorpe. He could do a lot of things. And we had Gary and Bobby, and Jeff was the quarterback, and we had a pretty good line. And we marched up and down the field. As I recall, we were inside the 5-yard line 4 times, and we just couldn't get the ball across. Something would happen. We'd try a sweep, they would stop. I can't second guess the game call, but at the end of the half, we had held them, I think to minus yards at least in the first half. And at the end of the half, they were moving the ball only because we had a preventive defense in. We were just running the clock out. And so we put a loose 6-3, put the linebackers back, and let them score their way or move their ball down the field. They got within field goal range around a 30-yard line, 25-yard line. And Smells came out and kicked this field goal. And it was okay, they scored, but
Not
everybody,
concerned at the time.
everybody,
Right.
you know, if anybody would have bet that that's how that game was going to be, end 3-0, it would have won a lot of money. And it just wasn't to be. And we were deflated terribly when we lost that game. They had another good running back. His name escapes me. It's 50 years, but yeah, they had a pretty good team.
And it was, I mean, you're
Yeah.
exactly right. People 3-4 deep around the fence, all the bleachers, and it was just a great game. Obviously, the outcome wasn't the way you would have liked it. However, I can tell you 3 games that you thoroughly enjoyed the outcome of. You played in 3 Turkey Day wins for Mount Carmel area.
Against Shamokin,
Sure.
yeah, they were glorious games. They were backyard rivalry, anything you want to call it. But it's funny. I played against a guy who was a quarterback, Moon Romanowski. That was 50 years ago. And today, I have one grandchild. He has one grandchild, and it's the same grandchild.
About that.
His son married my daughter, and they have a son, Shepherd.
Can you set that atmosphere, Turkey Day atmosphere? It was a morning game, a 10 o'clock game, 11 o'clock game usually, but just the environment of that game.
It was a cultural phenomenon.
Yes.
It's hard to describe to the generations later how the game was important because of the Shamokin and Mount Carmel. It was for the, the coal bucket and everything. It was different because it wasn't a night game. It was an afternoon game, early afternoon. When the game was over, people went home and ate the turkey and so forth. And plus there was a week off. The season ended not the week before, but 2 weeks before. So you had the extra week to recover, to hone your plays. And the excitement was very electric. Not just through the communities, but on the team. We could see it and hear it in our coaches. There was a sense of urgency about everything we did. And so we're sky high for the game.
And I remember everybody dressed. Corsages for the women, guys had a suit on and a top coat and a nice hat.
That was our Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
Without the mint julep.
And it was just a wonderful thing to be part of. It's a shame that because of changes that have taken over the years that's no longer part of our landscape here. But it was one wonderful day, and those like yourself who have played in it will always talk about the Turkey Day games.
Yeah.
Now, your high school record were 31-2-0. And I'm wondering, playing for Jazz as an 18-year-old boy, did you recognize the genius?
We knew Mount Carmel football was we all grew up knowing it was special, but during the 60s, when Jazz arrived, every year was just a little bit better, and we got a little closer to our goals. And we were producing some tremendous football players. Joe Baczynski was an All-American quarterback.
Yep.
So Baczynski leaves, and what's Mount Carmel going to do? Turn to Greg Doviak, another All-American quarterback. Running backs like Gary Diminick and Bobby Veach. Gary set the state scoring record. And so the level of pride in what we were doing was all-time high. We had complete confidence in the coaching staff. Whatever they would tell us to do, jump over that wall, we were on our way. And I don't know if you can bring all those elements together, community, team, coaches. When you play Mount Carmel, you got to play the whole town.
That's exactly right. And George Rona, Alfie Santos, and Joe Greco were the assistants on that team. But what I always admired in retrospect is Jazz, I think, was one of the first coaches to put so much emphasis on special teams.
Yes.
And punt returns, kickoff returns, things like that. And I asked him one time, I said, you've had such great success with that. I said, how many kickoff or punt returns were against Mount Carmel? He said, in my career, 3. So he was way ahead of people.
No, and it was a good way to bring a lot of people
Playing time.
on a team. Guys that weren't starting, but the special teams, they were heroes.
Well, Jazz left with 267 wins, 81 losses, 7 ties, and ironically, the last tie was his last game here as head coach at Mount Carmel area, 12-12 against Shikellamy. Bobby were named first team All-State, the first lineman since Dan Ficca in 1955. So there haven't been there's been a slew of first team All-Staters here at Mount Carmel, but very few linemen. Now, we're going to switch over, and we're going to talk about wrestling. I'm Tom Ryan. I'm with Judge Bob Sacavage, and we're talking a little bit about the year 1969 as we now step into wrestling season. The undefeated football team played for the Eastern Conference Championship, didn't have the success you would have liked to have against Blakely, but what it did do, playing in that game, is push everything in wrestling back a little bit. So you got a late start, but I think we can start talking about your wrestling career by talking about your dad, who I'm sure was your first coach.
That's correct. My dad coaching me started as an infant. It's funny, I have a grandson now, and I find myself rolling around the floor and showing him wrestling moves.
Sure.
So it occurred to me, that's probably what happened to me.
Did you have an interest all through grade school, junior high? Was it a priority, or was it football and then wrestling?
No, it was mostly wrestling through the grade school years. My father was coaching in the 1950s, and I was always hanging out with the team. They had some very good teams. I remember sitting on a bench when a chair would open and stealing some oranges from the guys, but they had Charlie Burkowski on a team, Hunk Kulik. They had just a very good team all around. So I was exposed to it, and I was just chomping at the bit to get in a competition.
Now, you step into high school, Frank Bacchitis is your coach. Tell us a little bit about Coach Bacchitis.
Frank is one of the finest gentlemen I've ever known. He was totally enthusiastic. He loved every minute of working in a sport. I still see him occasionally. I wish I saw him more. I'm retired now, but Frank we had a very good group of wrestlers that when he arrived, and he was very successful. I think we had a Northumberland County trophy for the best team.
I think the JCs used to get that
we
out.
retired that after 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
And what can I say about Frank? But he was successful, and he was a tremendous role model, highly respected by all the wrestlers, fans, and I'm deeply indebted to him for the guidance that he gave me.
Talk about switching training methods from football to wrestling. You had about 3 weeks.
It's totally different. To be involved in football, it's hard conditioning, but when you think about break football down, you're active for 15 seconds, 10 seconds, and then you stop for 30 seconds. So after every play, you're going to get a short break. With wrestling, it's very intense. It's every muscle in your body, and it's a grueling sport, and the transition is hard. You have to adjust to that. And then in those days, wrestling was a little different. There was more emphasis on weight loss than there is today, and it's good that they got away from that. But that was always a tough thing to do. In football, you can eat all you want, but in wrestling, you had to watch your diet.
All right, you were at 165 for wrestling. What weight did you play at football?
I played at about 183, and that's part of it. Then it was
So you got to drop
cutting down.
18
Yeah,
to get ready
So-
for the Carlisle tournament.
correct. And that was over the Christmas holidays. We were fortunate. It was a late start in the schedule that year. Ordinarily, the starting would have been mid-December.
Right.
And I was playing football in mid-December, so that was an advantage. But I was in pretty good shape year-round. I played baseball, and I was always doing something.
You know, it's interesting. Years ago, on a national televised basketball game, Dick Enberg was going on about how college basketball players are the best conditioning athletes in the world. And Al McGuire said, no, they're not. The best conditioned college athletes are wrestlers. Well, you got off to a great start. You know, you came out of the gate flying, 3 pins at the Carlisle tournament, runner-up for the most valuable wrestler, and then you followed with 7 more pins in a row as the season went on. Now, in those days, you didn't get a whole lot of opportunity to scout your opponents. Unlike today, they have videos and all those type of things. Did you use the same approach essentially with each opponent, or did you let the tone of the match dictate how you were going to wrestle this guy?
Yeah. The intelligence that we received on the opposition was rather limited. Occasionally, one of the assistant coaches would get to see a match, but it's hard to really cover each of like 12 bouts and take notes and try and remember everything. When you scout at wrestling, you just look for trends. This team seems to like double leg takedowns or single leg takedowns. So we get some information about trends, but we never, or I never had the opportunity to sit down and map out an individual strategy for an opponent, with a few exceptions. When I wrestled Shorty Hitchcock,
We'll get to him.
I had received a lot of information. It seemed like every day of my senior year I was receiving another story about this tough guy in a northern tier.
I guess a lot of people will say, you might want to stay away from this guy.
Yeah.
But if you start with 7 pins, you finish with 3, you're undefeated.
After the 10th pin, the next fellow I wrestled, it was, they didn't end matches after 15 points, but I'm talking about the 11th, there were 10 pins, and I tried every way, shape, or form to pin this guy. I scored 18 points, and I don't know if the referee was calling pins that night, but that's what happened. Then I went on and started another streak. But
how much of your success in your senior year in terms of falls would you attribute to your innate ability or more to your strength?
I think it's a combination of both. You have to know the pinning combinations, and wrestling is a sport that it's hard just to learn in a year or two. And I had been doing it, since I was a juvenile, and just the kind of feel and the use of leverage, all these little things that combined. When you felt that you had the opening, when you felt some relaxation, something on your opponent that enabled you to move in, and then the ability to use the right pinning combination. I used different approaches, sometimes based on the size of the opponent. If I had a tall fellow to wrestle, it was very difficult to cover his whole body. You had to pick which way you're going to go, the top half or the bottom half. I might take the bottom half and use leg rides, a cross-body ride, and work that way. So there were a lot of factors that came into it.
Well, you finished the regular season undefeated in a national record style, as a match was added during the year with Millersburg. Youngster named Al Sunday was your opponent, and of course you pinned him in 4 seconds of the first period. That 4 second is still a national record for your weight class. Now, in looking for information on this, I was very surprised to see that in a number of weight classes, the national record is 3 seconds. So I know it's going to take us longer to talk about this 4 second pin than it took you to accomplish the feat, but tell us a little bit about that.
Well, as you mentioned, I had a lot of pins, and I try to wrestle aggressively, and this particular match was an add-on. Millersburg was wrestling in their first year, and they got creamed by every team that wrestled. So we were going into that, and so when we weighed in, the fellow I was wrestling, I guess Al Sunday, he was shaking. He looked a little terrified and all. But going into it, I had some thought about not going after a pin because the sectional tournaments were coming up the next week, and I thought I might just hang in there, get a workout. I knew he was a novice, but maybe we overplayed it. We weren't going to go out and try and humiliate these guys in their first year of wrestling. And some of the matches before me were a lot closer than anyone would have anticipated. So by the time we were midway through the match, right around the time Mark Sassani, who preceded me, was wrestling, we said, okay, let's finish this. Let's go out. And I wrestled him, and I had a few quick pins earlier in the year. I think I wrestled a fellow from Minersville, and I had him in under 10 seconds. And I threw him so fast, my hand was caught under his shoulder. And it took me an extra few seconds to get the hand out. So I knew it was possible. And also, there are things that you do in a training room. I trained with 4 or 5 guys on a team who were close to my weight class, and I would take 30-second sprints all through they each had to just wrestle me for 30 seconds, then they could sit down. And I, just for fun, I would go out and see how quickly I could do these things. So I knew I was capable of pinning somebody quickly, but never had a clock. I never knew what the record was or anything like that. And that particular night, let me also give a disclaimer here. The referee for that add-on match was my father, right, Charles Sacavage. And that raises an eyebrow immediately, with good cause. Why wouldn't it? I mean, I can assure you we had no conversations. He refereed maybe a half dozen of my matches over the years, but there was no special setup there, and he was not the guy who was on a time clock or the score. That was Jerry Breslin and Tim Barnes, who had been doing it for
long time,
20 or 30 years.
Sure.
So I wasn't out there to set any record. I just was out there, and he gave me the opportunity. As soon as we shook hands, he lingered and reached in with his right hand, and I hit him with a head and arm. It's like taking a steer or something right down. So everything just fell right into place. I hit him. He was down. Maybe it was 3 seconds. I don't know. But the scorer was astonished, and I was sitting down on a bench by that time, and they stopped the match, and Jerry Breslin, with that great voice of his,
sure,
I think we might have something special here tonight. And,
well, it stood for 50 years.
Yeah. Let me tell you another story about that. When you were talking about scouting,
Right.
that night, Shorty Hitchcock's coaches, it was in the Coltmont Gymnasium, came to scout me. So I don't know what they ended up telling Shorty when they got back, but I laugh about that.
Well, you got to feel good about having a national record that stood for 50
it was
years.
an unexpected thing, and I didn't know how long it lasted. Probably about 25 years ago, somebody did a story on it and called me. I went through the same thing.
Sure. Now, here we go. State tournament. Starting sectionals. You go in there at 16-0. Top seed, obviously. Did you feel pressure to become Mount Carmel area's second state champion? Did you feel that there was a monkey on your back? Ed Riccozzi won it in 1939, the second year that the PIAA sponsored wrestling. He won at 155 pounds. And in those days, Rec Hall was nirvana. You wanted to get to Rec Hall. Did you feel pressure as you began sectionals and knew you had to work your way through the tournament?
Yeah, the pressure built as you went through the season. There were some significant hurdles ahead of that. I had Shorty Hitchcock and Ed Ott in the district. After I had defeated Shorty Hitchcock.
Well, let's back up to sectionals. Okay,
Yeah.
You went in there and no problems, 3-0. Nobody really gave you a hard time. Now you step into districts and you're going up against two names that are still prominent in Pennsylvania sports. Eddie Ott from Muncie, who went on to have a distinguished career in Major League Baseball, and Shorty Hitchcock of Wyalusing went on to win a world championship in wrestling. I think he won an NCAA title at Bloom, coached at Shamokin, coached at Millersville until, unfortunately, at age 50, he was taken from us. He was as strong a person, I think, as I've ever shaken hands with.
He's the strongest, one of the strongest persons, certainly the strongest person that I ever wrestled. But that's right, scouting. I knew ahead of time well what I was getting into. And
so you beat Shorty 4-1. What approach did you use?
well, I was learned that Shorty had this legendary strength, but he was mostly from his waist up. He had tremendous chest, shoulders, back, neck. And my report was that if there was an area that he was not so strong at, was his legs. And so I had determined that I was going to try and not work strength against strength. I would not be able to compete with him at that level, that I had to be a little scientific here, and I had some strategy mapped out in my head. Shorty helped the situation along when the opening bell, and we shook hands, and I went at him to tie up with him, and he literally, as I recall it, picked me up from under the elbows and just tossed me off the mat. And that was a very good lesson, wake-up call immediately. Don't dare try to go into that strength anymore. So I bobbed, I weaved, I danced. There was no score at the end of the period. And in the second period, I was on top, and I engaged the cross-body ride and worked him the whole 2 minutes. In the last 30 seconds of the match, I applied a pinning combination. It's called various things. I'm not sure what it is today. We called it a guillotine.
Right, okay.
Some people called it a crucifix.
Right.
And it's a painful move when it's applied. I had stretched his body a couple ways and then exposed him to his back. I was tied up on his legs, and then I pulled his head back against the grain almost, and the referee was counting out the seconds for points, and the period ended. I thought if I would have had another second or two, I could have gotten a pin, but I got a predicament, and I also had 2 minutes riding time built up, which was very good. So I was effectively had 4 points on a board, and then the third period was surviving the frontal assault. And,
Yeah, just don't get pinned.
yeah, so we bounced and bobbed and weaved, and it ended up
Of course,
4-1.
then later on, Ed Ott, you pinned him.
I did him in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Ed was a very good wrestler, came from a wrestling family, and of course a great baseball player. Ed gave me a shock. Throughout the year, I had not had a point scored upon me, not an escape or a takedown or anything. And Ed came out there like gangbusters and took me down.
Wow.
And I was a little taken aback there, but I got out of it, recovered, and by the third period, I was back in the swing, and I pinned
controlling
him.
the match then.
Yeah, I pinned him in the third
You
period.
remember the
then.
combination?
I remember what his takedown was. That was a fireman's carry. I think it was a cradle.
Okay. It's interesting that all those matches, and yet first time anybody scored any points on them. Excuse me. Now, get up to regionals. Boy from William Allen, you beat him 4-3. Sagetta and then Weber from Wilkes-Barre Myers 13-3. So 2 decisions. Now you're on your way to rec hall.
Well, I had a lesson I learned as a junior. I finished a season winning the sections and the districts, and the philosophy was work, 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 always wrestle tough. I was in practice with my teammate, John Skinner, who was a weight class above me, and we were just battling it out. And I ended up cracking my collarbone and was finished for the season. And so I learned a lesson that if I get this far next time, to be smart.
Your senior year, sure.
And so at that time, I was training and doing more road work than I was doing the actual wrestling. I didn't want to leave it on a practice match again. And when I got into those, I was careful about wrestling, and you can get a little careless when you're going for a pin. When you go to pin a guy, you sometimes have to expose yourself. You have to give up a little to get some. And so I wrestled more conservatively in those last 2 tournaments than I had done before.
Now, at that time, and many of our viewers probably will not remember this, but it was one and done. There were no wrestlebacks. It was a one and done tournament. If you won, you moved on. If you lost, you were out of the tournament. And of course, now you're at Rec Hall. You're 2 matches away from winning a state championship. The entire community, of course, is behind you. And here we go, and your semifinal match was your 3rd 1-0 win of the year. Talk about that.
I remember that match very well. I remember walking in a rec hall, and I was elated. Some of my classmates were there ahead of me and put up some streamers on the bleachers, and that felt good. So I know I had the Mount Carmel people there.
Phil Tillison, by the way, from
Yeah.
Mount Lebanon.
Yeah, Phil was a real tough, strong wrestler. He was built similar to me. He was a little more on the stocky side. And it was a grueling match. We wrestled, that's the hardest 6 minutes maybe I ever wrestled in high school. We battled it out on our feet. It wasn't one of these matches where 2 people are just waltzing around. We were hitting each other with moves. It was a move, counter move, wrestle, out of bounds, come back. And we went into the second period, no score. And I was on top. And this guy was a lot to contend with. And I held him down for 2 minutes. I don't know how I did that. There were many close ones right on the circle there. Referee blew the whistle outside. Had he not blown the whistle at that moment, perhaps he would have had a reversal or escape. But I did. I held him down, and I acquired 2 points in a bag for riding time. And of course, but there was no score on a board, so we went into the third period. And a thing that shot through my mind is that I can't let this guy get his power into me and do to me what I just did to him. And so I practiced one of my more explosive moves was a stand-up. I mean, a stand-up where you just don't put one foot after another, but the whistle blows and you're out of there, like a ring-necked pheasant flushing. And,
Okay.
And that's what I did. I got out of there in a nanosecond and got the 1 point. So, I'm sorry, let me take that back. I stood up like that and tried to blow out of there 20 times, and he held me, drove me out of bounds. And what happened by the end, my 2 minutes riding time got washed out because he held me down.
Right.
And so in the last 10, 15 seconds, that's when I just kept moving and moving and moving until there was a little let up on him, and I got the 1 point and beat him 1-0.
So an exciting match.
And a grueling match.
And you're going, that was in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Now you got to come back a couple hours later at night to wrestle for the gold, and had a little easier time. Bruce Jones out of Newport, one of those Newport Buffaloes, beat him 7-4 for the title.
Yeah. Bruce was one of those long, tall guys I mentioned before. And he had been a runner-up the year before in a state championship, so he's experienced. I did the same thing. I decided to wrestle him, from the bottom down.
Okay.
And I used the legs and scored some points. And I was steadily moving with the points. And in fact, I got a penalty point. We were on our feet, I remember. And now in wrestling, they have rules, especially in college. You put your hand in a fellow's face, you get a warning or you lose a point. In those days, you got away with it, but I got a good poke in the eye there, and I had to stop for 20 seconds till I regained my vision. In the match, I remember I was telling you about the pinning combinations.
Right.
So I had an opportunity, and I told you about how it feels and where the pressure is coming and where it's not. I went after a pin, like I did with Shorty Hitchcock. I worked my way into taking him with that guillotine. Now, the difference was that this was a long guy and he had a lot of leverage. Had him in a pinning combination, and the referee was counting out the seconds, and I gave a little too much. I got up a little too high, and he was a great wrestler, and he used his leverage, flipped me, added a pinning combination, threw me on my back, and scored 4 points. But by that time, I had some points in reserve and some riding time. I think it was 7-4.
7-4 was the final, and you accomplish your goal. You're a state champion, the second one in Mount Carmel area high school history. Of course, since then, Mike Garcia has won 3, and Steve Sacavage has won 1 as well. Your wrestling career in high school, 91, 9, and 1. And from Mount Carmel area high school to Broadway. And we'll be back to talk about that right after this. All right, we're back. I'm Tom Ryan with Judge Bob Sacavage. We're reminiscing about his wrestling career here at Mount Carmel area high school. And I would like to apologize to John Zukowski, who we did not mention was a state champ here at Mount Carmel area in 1942. So if we go through them correctly, you can run through them.
Well, Ed Ricosi,
Right.
I believe, was 1939,
Right.
And John Zukowski was 1942. After I had won that state championship, I believe it was the annual sports banquet for wrestling, and somebody had good thought and brought the 2 former state champions, and I had met them at that time. I got to know Ed Ricosi pretty well later in life. He showed up at the county courthouse one day.
Wanted to wrestle you.
Yeah, I was in a library, and he was up in age already, and he and his wife came in. I thought they were lost. I was can you help me? He said something about wrestling, and at that time the wrestling state tournament was going on. I says, maybe you're in the wrong place. You want to go down to Hershey, there's a tournament. He goes, no, I want to see this wrestling judge. And I said, come on, who are you? And then he said, Ed Ricosi, and I remembered who he was. We struck up a real good friendship after that. He told me any number of stories. He was at Pearl Harbor. Wow. He was in the military. And he told me along the way he moved around a lot, and he had lost his state champion medal. And after he was gone, I called my brother, Greg, who was is the athletic director, and told him that story about the medal. And Greg was smart enough. He called the PIAA, and they gave him a replacement medal, and we presented that to him at another wrestling banquet.
Good. And John Zukowski won in 42, then you in 65, Mike Garcia 3 in the 80s or early 90s, and of course then Steve Sacavage. So a proud wrestling tradition here, and you decided to go to Broadway. Columbia University, of course, is located on Broadway in New York. And who else talked to you about wrestling for them, and why Columbia?
Well, I was recruited by a number of schools for football and for wrestling.
Talk about that.
The football, I mean, I was playing football at 182 pounds or so, and I wasn't cut out to be a lineman at a higher level. I was recruited by Bucknell, Gettysburg, Lafayette, Mid-Atlantic level schools for football. But wrestling, there was an interest of Penn State, and Lehigh, Army, and Navy. Quite a few schools came around, and I liked the idea of wrestling for Penn State or Lehigh, but my father was an educator, and my mother was very big on education. My older brother was at Bucknell receiving a great education at the time. And so I thought I better look out for the rest of my life too. And Columbia University recruited me. In fact, they came around when I was a junior. They initially were recruiting me for football. And then the wrestling people told the guy that was recruiting me to switch gears and recruit me for wrestling. And they did, and it was a good fit. I liked the people there. I was a kid from Mount Carmel in the coal region. I remember going into Manhattan for the first time. I had a stiff neck from looking at the large buildings. And I was enthralled with the idea, and I made the decision to. I was also recruited. I almost changed my mind at the last minute. George Edwards from Shamokin,
Yes, wrestling
great
coach of
wrestling
Virginia.
family,
Yeah.
just became the wrestling coach at the University of Virginia, and he recruited me, and it was pretty late into the spring already. And I loved the University of Virginia. It was a beautiful, magnificent
Gorgeous
campus.
campus.
George they were almost like family. I knew the Edwards family, and I continue to know them and respect them. But I thought, well, I was pretty far gone and committed. And I went to Columbia. No regrets. It was a great education. It was a separate education in itself, learning how to survive in New York City.
Well, that's one of the things I want to talk about. Most young people, their freshman year in college, it's a big step. All right, so you're stepping from Mount Carmel into Broadway, Manhattan, New York City, upscaled academics, and also wrestling. How difficult was all of this for you to handle as a freshman?
It was total, cultural shock. There wasn't much of anything that I lived and did in Mount Carmel that or anybody, for that matter, could prepare you for that change. I just took a deep breath. I committed to put my nose to the grindstone academically. I was in the Ivy League. I was happy for the opportunity. They had a good wrestling program, a good coach. I made friends with my teammates immediately, and I had a lot of second guessing that first semester. Did I do the right thing? It's a concrete jungle in New York, and I had some thoughts. Boy, Penn State might be a nice bucolic setting there. Maybe I should have gone there, But I wanted ultimately to be a lawyer, and this was the best percentage for me. It was a very good wrestling program. It wasn't the same kind of competition you would get at the level of Penn State or Lehigh, but I was satisfied with it, and I did fairly well. And
Oh, you did very well. You were a two-time team captain, three-time letter winner, all EIWA, Eastern Intercollegiate Collegiate Wrestling Association. You wrestled in the NCAA tournament, and you were named all Ivy League. I'd say you did pretty well.
Well, yeah, I had some success.
You certainly did.
I had one award in there that was for pinning. Pins weren't as easy to achieve
Well,
at the
all
college
right,
level.
let me interrupt you here, because that's my next question.
Okay.
The difference between wrestling in high school and college.
Well, example, when I was a senior, I wrestled, Ed Ott and the competition maybe at the district, state level and all like that. In college, there's no break. It's every week you have a top competition.
Right.
You don't get an easy day. There's nobody like Al Sunday that you can pin in 4 seconds. Sure. So you had to be well-trained and ready to go. I learned a lot from the coaching staff at Columbia. My wrestling coach was a Penn Stater, Jerry Seckler. He was an old friend of Joe Paterno. They worked together in the 1950s. And then I had an assistant coach who was a superstar at Bloomsburg University, Ron Russo, okay. And had won many, many awards. And Ron and Jerry taught me some new styles, and it was not so easy to go and pin somebody every week, although I got my share. I was lucky in my senior year at the Eastern Wrestling Tournament. Sometimes these pins just occur. You get the break, and I had 3 pins in a tournament. I won an award, a Sheridan Award, for the name of the legendary Lehigh coach for the most pins in the fastest times. So I was happy about that, and that was my last flame, so to speak, in my wrestling career.
Well, we've talked about your success on the high school level. We've talked about your success at the collegiate level. Tell our viewers about how you handled the bear.
I should have suspected that, but it's funny. I had hung up the tights and the sneakers, and I went to law school, which was
We'll talk about that in a couple minutes.
And I went to Villanova Law School. And I was still in pretty good shape. You just graduate as a senior, you're a wrestler. And wrestling, Villanova had a good football program, a basketball program, but they had no wrestling. And so I was looking, to wrestle a little bit. In fact, I used to go down to Penn, Larry Lockley.
Sure.
I wrestled against in high school for 4 years.
Muncie guy.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he was on the 1960 Olympic team, married to
Barbara.
Barbara Edwards.
Sure.
So it was like old family. I knew him from high school, and I'd call him and go down and work out with his Penn teams. I had an interesting story there. It was my first year in law school, and one day after classes, I went down to Penn to work out. I was working out with their heavyweights, and there was a guy in the wrestling, he was an older guy, and he had an old-time rubber suit on. He was sweating profusely, and he was working into our three-man drills. And I took a break, and it was me and the other guy, and this old guy was wrestling somebody else. And I asked my guy that I was wrestling, I said, who is that guy? I said, he's the ugliest guy I have ever seen. What happened to his nose? His nose went this way and that way and back this way. And the guy says, you're kidding. You don't know who that is. I says, no. He says, that's Chuck Bednarik.
Oh, boy.
Concrete
Charlie.
Yeah. So, and Chuck was a wrestler, and he was a great wrestling fan. And so I got to talk to him, and it was great talking to him. He says, where are you from? I said, oh, you won't know where I'm from, a little town up in a coal region. He goes, where is it? I says, Mount Carmel. He goes, I said, don't tell me you're in Mount Carmel. Of course I was in Mount Carmel. He goes, I'm married to a girl from Monterey City.
How about that?
Yeah, small world.
Yeah.
But the bear I had, this is an example that you should be careful what you say. Your words sometimes come back to haunt you. So Villanova, this was when I was my last semester. I had everything wrapped up. I was, coasting. And I was an RA in the dormitories. In fact, I was the head RA. And some of the guys on the floor, we chit-chat and all. And one day they came in, hey, we heard you were a big-time wrestler. And I said, well, I had my day in the sun, blah, blah, blah. And they says, well, how about this? You want to wrestle this? And they held out the newspaper, and it was a cartoon caricature. It was this bear, Victor the wrestling bear.
Okay.
And I laughed, and I just shooed it off. I said, get out of here. The next day, I was having lunch with my colleagues, my classmates, and we had lunch regularly, and they were RAs in a dorm, and they were not the athletic type, more the academic type. But one of the guys who were there said, well, Bob, tell us, what are you doing with your athletic career these days? I was always active, I played on the flag football team, I played on the law school rugby team, and so I was just trying to get a rise out of him, say something funny. And I said, well, I'm considering wrestling a bear. And, everybody dropped their soup spoons and says, what? And I was just playing, and I was kidding. By the end of the afternoon, it was all over the school. Sacavage is going to wrestle the bear. And so, now I had a safe face. And I called up, and there was this wrestling bear. There was an event at the Civic Center, an all-sports event where mostly they had outdoor things, Coleman and camping and hunting people. And this was a draw. Some wrestling bear would take on all comers. And it's a long story, but I'll shorten it. I end up, going down there with my old college uniform, talked to the guy that owned the bear, who was in this kind of Tarzan outfit here with like a leopard skin. And we negotiated the terms. I asked him, how do you pin a bear? How could you beat a bear? He has, no shoulder blades. And so we agreed ahead of time that the international rules, that's where you expose his back for a moment. That's what it is.
Put him on a deck.
Yeah. So I said, okay. And now we're back to intelligence, to scouting. And this was just a happenstance thing. Before this event takes place, to open the arena that night, they had somebody called the Kite Man. This is a guy who has apparatus,
Yes.
and he flies around the arena, and he comes down on a stage where this wrestling mat was. He gets a big hand, and he comes over to the sidelines where I'm standing in his wrestling regalia, and I start talking to him. He's about my age, and it turned out that he had been a wrestler himself for Westchester College, I believe. And so I start pumping him for information. I said, "Do you go around to these things?" And he goes, "Yeah, did you ever see this bear wrestle?" And I pumped him, and I was getting a report, and he was a good guy to give it, because I said, "Well, can you put a half Nelson on the bear?" And he said, "No, don't do that. The bear, he'll break your arm." And I said, "How big is the bear?" "He's huge. He's got a head like this. He's an Alaskan brown bear."
So he's what, 600 pounds?
600, 650. When he was on his toes, close to 7 feet. And I had never seen this bear. I didn't know what to expect. I got all kind of misinformation that I had to go into a cage with him. Anyway, so the kite man, I said, "Can I put a chicken wing?" He told me what I couldn't do. But the kite man told me he had seen people beating the bear. And this was almost like a vaudeville kind of thing. And bear was 10,000-0, but I'm sure he went to his grave 10,000-0. You can't have a bear that's 10,001. So I knew what I could and couldn't do. The bear was weakest on his feet. When they brought this creature out, and we stood, man and beast, and I was grabbing these clumps of flesh, hanging over him. My face was in his chest. His whole head was on top of me. And the kite man gave me advice on how he had seen the bear beaten. And he said, "The bear is going to press you and put you down." The bear has some wrestling moves, but he only executes them really when he gets you down on a mat. So if you stay up. So I stayed up and parried and danced around with this bear a little bit, and then finally the bear was reaching to push me down, and I timed it. When the bear went to push me, I hit him what we call a duck under.
Okay.
He duck under and around. He went down onto his fours. I was behind him. I jumped onto his back, and I used what we call like a crab ride. It's something that you're using your knees, your elbows, and the bear would walk around and try and tear me off, and I'd duck, and he'd tear me off. And finally, I timed it. When the bear was reaching back, I reached under his snout, and he had a muzzle on.
Right.
And I grabbed him under the muzzle and tore his head backward, and he went flying back onto his back, and that was it. That was the bear. People asked me what I received, and I said, I received nothing. I had to pay $5 to get in to wrestle the bear.
That's an amazing story, and you touched on one of my favorite stories about Kite Man. Certainly around the time that you were wrestling the bear, Kite Man, one of the things he was doing was flying the first baseball in the stadiums on opening day.
Yep.
And he was scheduled to do that down in Baltimore, came up short and crashed into the parking lot and broke the play-by-play guy's window. But you don't see those guys anymore. We don't have those kind of guys around anymore.
I think they probably outlawed bear wrestling by now.
Now, you get your degree at Columbia. Why the law?
Well, from childhood, high school, my father was a math teacher. My brother was excellent, top math student. I didn't get that gene. I had more of a poet's gene. I liked history and novels and English and so forth. And I was always a movie buff and a history buff, and my older brother was a history major.
Outstanding educator.
And he spent a career, he's still educating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, so he and I, growing up, we did a lot of fishing together. We were always in a car driving together, and he was 5 years ahead of me. So he was already at the college level, and he would quiz me and teach me history, and we'd talk about it. I really loved this subject, and it was a natural progression, because when you love history, American history, you want to know how it works, and what's the Constitution about, and what are these Bill of Rights, and by the time I was in Columbia, one of the good things and that helped me with the decision at Columbia was the number of people that graduated that went on to advanced degrees. And it was a very, very high percentage, and it's like that, you know, throughout the Ivy League.
That's a tradition in the Ancient Eight, that people go on
they
for
go on.
advanced
And so
degrees,
that's,
sure.
so I thought that would suit my needs. And that's why I went into the law, and I've never regretted that. I've had a good career in the law. I loved every day of it.
It's interesting because once you earned your law degree at Villanova, there are a number of areas in which you could apply this degree, and you chose public service, eventually becoming a district attorney for 10 years, I believe, in Northumberland County.
12.
And then 20 years on the bench, retiring as the president judge. And your reputation as a jurist is outstanding. And we're going to come back here in a couple of minutes and wrap this up. So stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back, and Bob, before we wrap up this more than interesting conversation, many years ago, my mentor, Father Woodrow Wilson Jones, who used to say he was a priest, a Marine, and a Democrat, but not necessarily in that order. And Father Jones was looking to get back in the area. He had retired and was down in the Lebanon area. And through the kindness of late County Commissioner Jim Kelly and your generosity, you provided him with an apartment and a place to live. And the last couple of years of his life, he had the good life, which he certainly earned.
I met Father Woody Jones on the campaign trail one year, and it was a morning breakfast event. And a lot of the candidates were a little tired from the night before, and I was listening to the priest that was there deliver the invocation, and I'm sitting there listening, and pretty soon this priest is getting all worked up, and he starts calling fire and brimstone down upon the Republicans, and I'm there, oh my God, you know, what's this? And I looked at Jim Kelly, and he's laughing at me, and afterward he introduced me to Woody Jones. We became friends there, and then you're right, he came back, and I had my law office
Right.
where I practiced in Mount Carmel, and I had a couple of apartments in there. The one that I had previously lived in was right above me, and so Woody came to stay, and I enjoyed having him around.
Oh, he's a great guy.
We had many, many conversations, and he was a witty and informative, funny guy. I miss him.
One of the most intelligent men that I have ever been around. And there aren't very many people know that he didn't go into the seminary till he was in his 40s. And at one time was one of the 3 people in Pennsylvania that had the authority to sign a check for $1 million. He was the executive assistant to the state treasurer, and a convert, and went to the seminary. And of course, we were blessed to have him here in our area for at least 15 years, and a good guy. So Paul and I certainly appreciate, my wife Paul, what you did for Father. So we'd like to present you with this. This is a summary of your senior year, your state championship matches, opponents, times, decisions. We'd like you to have that. And I also have something here symbolic of your state championship. And of course, there's no greater feeling than having your hand raised.
How do you like that? I
as
never
a
saw a statue like this
as
one.
a state champion. So I'm going to get you out of here on this question.
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
you're more than welcome. I want to get you out of here on this question. If you visit West Point, there's a statue of General MacArthur, and beneath it says, "On the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds on other fields that will bear the fruits of victory." How did that credo affect you in your athletic endeavors and in your public service?
It affected me profoundly. There's no question of the truth in those words. Sports builds character. Sports develops self-discipline, gives you goals, helps you meet friends, expands your horizon. For me, sports opened doors. You know, I had not been a state wrestling champion here in Pennsylvania, and the Columbia wrestling team looking to recruit somebody. Who knows where I would have been. But if it were not for the time I spent on a wrestling matches and a football fields and a baseball diamonds, I would have been a totally different person, maybe.
Well, you did well, all of us. You're the quiescent student athlete, outstanding in academics, obviously an Ivy League student, outstanding in your chosen career. Also, we could point out you were voted the most popular person in your class. You were the sports editor for the yearbook. Just a well-rounded and distinguished alumni of this high school. And Bob, it was a pleasure sitting here to talk
One
to you.
last word.
Sure,
And I
absolutely.
appreciate, and I said from the heart, the connection between sports and life. But the greatest influence on me were my mother and father. And whoever is watching this, any young people, don't ever forget it. Give Mom and Dad a big hug.
Isn't it funny how as you get older, your parents seem to get smarter?
They're brilliant.
They really are. Again, thank you for your time. Enjoyed talking to you. Paula Margaret, I'm on my way. Until next time, Tom Ryan for Bob Sacavage saying so long, everybody.